All right. Good evening, everyone. It's about 6:04, so we're gonna go ahead and get this wonderful evening program started. But we'll have some more people joining us as we begin. Um, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining the Maryland Center for History and Culture tonight. My name is Chloe Green. I serve as the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at MCHC, and I am your host for this evening's program, our virtual panel on madness, race, and insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. This program is being recorded and will be made available for public viewing on our virtual program archive in a couple weeks following this event tonight. And I will place that link in the chat shortly. This Zoom webinar is equipped with a Q&A chat function. If you have any questions or comments for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A chat, and we will reserve time at the end of the program for your questions, and it just makes it easier for our panelists to see them. And I'm going to begin the evening by introducing our moderator, and our moderator is going to introduce the panelists. So we're honored to have such a wonderful group of panelists here for this program. For the sake of time, we're going to give condensed versions of their intros, but we do want to acknowledge that we are only scratching the surface of all the wonderful work these people have done. So I want to start by giving a warm welcome to our moderator, David Armenti. So hi, David. David serves MCHC as our Vice President of Education and Engagement, and I have the lovely honor of working within his department. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the program in the evening over to you, David, and appreciate your time tonight and your expertise.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chloe. As you mentioned, we want to really jump right into it and give the floor to our distinguished panelists. So I'll go right ahead and introduce their biographies, and they can go ahead and turn on their cameras as I acknowledge them. So Rob Schoeberlein is well versed in the history of the city of Baltimore and beyond, and has worked with the Maryland State Archives since 1999 in various capacities. He earned his BA in History and Fine Arts from Georgetown, MA in Publication Design from University of Baltimore, MA in Historical Studies from UMBC, and later worked to obtain a PhD in American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. Throughout his career, Dr. Schoeberlein has lent his expertise to a variety of presentations, exhibitions, and publications, making him an award-winning writer. Dr. Schoeberlein also currently serves as the Baltimore City Archivist, and we're very lucky and pleased to have him here this evening. Hello.
I'm happy to be here.
Thanks so much. We also, of course, have Antonia Hylton, who is a Peabody and two-time Emmy Award-winning correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, and the New York Times bestselling author of Madness, subject of our talk this evening. She's the co-host of the hit podcast South Lake and Grapevine. Antonia graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 2015, where she received prizes for her writing and investigative research on race, mass incarceration, and the history of psychiatry. From 2016 to 2020, she served as a correspondent and producer for Vice Media and HBO's nightly news and documentary show, Vice News Tonight. Since 2019, she's also served as an annual judge for the American Mosaic Journalism Prize. We certainly have the pleasure of Antonia Hylton joining us this evening, so thank you so much for being here. We know it's a lot to get this time out of your busy schedule, so thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. And then last but certainly not least, we have Miss Janice Hayes-Williams, who is the owner and operator of Our Legacy Tours Annapolis, who has received several accolades and awards for her contributions as Annapolis's local historian. She's a seventh-generation African-American Marylander and an Annapolitan with deep roots championing awareness and appreciation of Annapolis's and Maryland's Black history. When she's not conducting historical research, Janice, you might find her consulting on a new museum exhibit, leading a tour, writing a column, advocating for recognition of a significant individual or event, or even hula hooping. And we'll certainly hear a lot more about Mrs. Hayes-Williams' contributions and some of the active and upcoming opportunities for commemoration related to the history we'll be discussing this evening. So, Janice Hayes-Williams, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So again, we are going to try to have space for all of our panelists to share some of their perspectives, research, and what they've brought to this work, and also hopefully save some time toward the end for Q&A from the audience. So with that said, I'm going to ask Dr. Schoeberlein to kick us off by providing a bit of scene setting around the history, the longer history of mental health institutions in the state of Maryland, and how that really led up to the point that Crownsville was established. So, Rob, do you think you could tell us a bit about the whole process?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Just a broad brush overview. The mentally ill population has been in Maryland since its colonial days. Though the numbers were small, we don't have a lot of information to frame a picture of what constituted their daily life. Many were kept with family, but others were actually boarded elsewhere with non-relatives who were paid by the county for their upkeep. It's not until the mid-1700s and the founding of county almshouses, also known as poorhouses, it's the first time the mentally ill were concentrated within a facility. And this was done as a cost-cutting measure due to the hard economic times at that point in history. County almshouses and sometimes jails continue to house what was then termed the pauper insane, the poor, the indigent insane in a regressive manner, in sparse surroundings, without regular medical supervision, a poor diet. Into the early 20th century, there was always a persistent population. With the mid-18th century, 1750s, you had the advent of public hospitals in America, and wards were set aside for the care and treatment of the mentally ill, including those with alcohol and drug dependency. Settings, however, continue to be primitive, maybe a bedding of straw upon the floor for persons of modest means. Well-to-do families could always pay additional money to provide more creature comforts. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the roots of the Maryland State Hospital. The circumstances founding the 1797 Baltimore Hospital are obscure. The Baltimore Hospital is the forerunner to today's still operating Spring Grove Hospital. All we know is that there were some influential families who banded together and petitioned the state to charter the institution. And Baltimore City money helped to fund it and get it started. Where was this? Actually, in Baltimore. It was the site of Johns Hopkins Hospital today was where Baltimore Hospital resided. It was 6 3/4 acres, and it was chosen because it was high up on a hill in that area, and they put in a vegetable garden and an orchard. There was a large central building and basically a tall wooden fence that encircled the whole perimeter. On a sort of sad note, unfortunately, the hospital to the south, looking toward the harbor, overlooked a cemetery. It was the Potter's Field where the indigent, the poor people were buried, and no doubt certain former patients from the hospital may have been buried there. Anyway, since few hospital records exist for this period, it's almost impossible to determine the number of patients under care. However, there was a study done in 1819 to 1820, and it showed only about 13% of the people in the hospital really had some sort of mental illness. Now, we talk about hospitals. Hospitals were better than almshouses and certainly jails. They stood as the first institutions where mental patients might expect care and safe confinement within a more humane environment. But there were different standards at that time. Hospitals were theoretically better. Let's talk about some hospitals, early hospitals, the Pennsylvania Hospital and the New York Hospital. They were both founded earlier in the 18th century, before the Baltimore Hospital. Generally, patients often found themselves confined within the room, chained up, sometimes wearing movement-restricted clothing. There was an attendant, there were attendants, and they might be armed with a whip to keep people from misbehaving, or horrible aspect of life then. There were few drugs that you could actually give individuals. Opiates and cannabis were about the only thing that could be administered. Some hospitals offered primitive forms of hydrotherapy, soaking in a hot or a warm tub, or a shower. But the care philosophy changed a great deal during the first half of the 1800s with the adoption of what was called moral treatment. Initiated by English Quakers, the new regimen stressed gentle persuasion, kindness, engaging the patient's thoughts, amusing them with music, and exercising them with light labor, walking, different activities. Moral treatment was fully instituted at the Baltimore Hospital by 1834. 1834 was a pivotal year. It was when the state of Maryland actually took over control of the institution. And from that point forward, it was renamed the Maryland Hospital. About everyday life at the Maryland Hospital, many, but not all patients engaged in some type of work specific to gender roles. No one was required by the staff to engage in work, nor was anyone paid for their efforts. For the male patients choosing to labor, jobs included gardening, working in the carpenter shop, the carting of wood and coal around the building for the fireplaces and the furnaces, or assisting the attendants in other duties. The female patients generally involved themselves in more domestic duties, such as sewing, knitting, or assisting in the wash house or kitchen. There had been, who knows, previous to the state takeover, but existing records show that a very small but persistent population of African-American patients, men and women, both free and those who were enslaved, could be found at the hospital. Patients' ages range from their late teens to their 60s. One female resident was there for over 23 years. An 1843 report noted 7 African Americans on the patient register, 4 free and 3 enslaved. There were only about 150 patients on the books at that time. However, the vast majority of mentally ill African Americans continue to be housed either with their families or in those county almshouses. This would change, but it took time. And I'll very quickly go into the circumstances of the campaign to found a hospital like Crownsville. It actually goes back earlier in the 19th century, the 1880s. There was something founded, the Lunacy Commission in 1886, that had, and it had the duty of inspecting all the almshouses throughout the state, all the counties, and reporting. Their annual reports pretty much spelled out the horrible conditions under which the mentally ill lived in the almshouses. This went on for many years. Almost every annual report calls for the building of a proper state facility for African Americans, because to quote one of the reports, the housing reserved for people of color was always of poorer condition than for whites. usually a dilapidated cabin, more or less clean and always overcrowded. 22 years would pass before any real action would be undertaken. Part of that is that the state was building roads, and a lot of the state funds went for road building. Economic considerations. The Lunacy Commission campaigned to bring state care before the public eye by producing a photographic expose of the almshouse living conditions. The most damning images were taken during a surprise nighttime inspection visit to the Monteview Asylum in Frederick County. It was their almshouse. It has a fancy name. But anyway, it captured the overcrowding sleeping accommodations for African Americans. In the opening session of the General Assembly in 1910, these photographs were actually on display in the old Senate chamber for the public and especially the legislators to see. It was just a few steps from their own chambers. And even the Sun newspaper reported, quote, "The photographs show the cells and dungeons of the county asylums. The overcrowding and inadequate accommodations afforded these unfortunates are graphically portrayed by these pictures." Well, the photographs and public pressure was finally able to convince the General Assembly to pass what was called the State Care Act, which in it also brought into the existence of what was called at that time the Hospital for the Negro Insane. And work commenced on building Crownsville in April of 1910. 31 male African-American patients from Monteview Asylum were put to work clearing the land and building a railroad spur to the hospital site. And that is just an intro. So I can answer questions later, but I don't want to take anyone's time away now.
Thank you, Rob. It's definitely a helpful setting of the stage there to know the history of how we get to the point of Crownsville's inception and understanding some of those political dynamics, certainly the racial dynamics that would continue to persist into the 20th century. So transitioning to Antonia, wonder if you could kind of tell us a bit about first, maybe how you learned about Crownsville, kind of how did you come into this work, and what was it about that case study that really grabbed you and made you want to learn more and ultimately end up researching to the point that you produced this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I came to this work as a student first, a college student, a teenager, in fact, and also as a family member of someone with several people with lived experience, living with a mental health disorder and seeking treatment in facilities in the United States. I come from a family with a long history of needing that kind of care. I had a great grandfather sent to a segregated ward or wing of an asylum in Michigan. And I have loved ones who needed care and were unable to access it for various reasons. And so I arrive on my college campus my freshman year, and I'm trying to figure out who I am and what I want to be. And I stumbled into a course that was about the history of psychiatry. And I immediately fell in love from the very first lecture. But, a few months in, I noticed that for all the good intentions and great work that people in that department were doing, they really very rarely talked about any people of color, but there really were no Black doctors, no Black patients, no Black people who were part of the story of psychiatry in the United States, who were represented in the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I just knew because of my family connection that there was something wrong with that, that there were a lot of stories untold. So I went looking for them, and I came across Crownsville. I came across a monograph written by a social worker who had just taken a look at all of the formerly segregated mental institutions throughout the United States. And she just had a couple short paragraphs about Crownsville, She had spoken to a few people, like Paul Lurs. Many people on this call are probably familiar with him. He worked at Crownsville for decades and made immense contributions. And she just had a few reflections on the place, included pretty limited quotes. But the few things that were on my mind after discovering that this place closed in 2004. So there are people who are alive and can talk about what it was like to work there. The buildings still stand, and there were records that have survived, housed at the Maryland State Archives. There were employees who even had records or artifacts of old furniture in their homes and attics. So I knew, okay, there are people I can call. I can start to understand this place. I can get some people on the phone and ask them questions. And at first as a student, and then in my early career in journalism, that was what this really was all about, was to marry all of these sources, to get access to the Maryland State Archives and to look at the letters, the hospital reports, and all that was rescued there by Rob and Paul, by the way. And then to do a massive oral history project, to get my own original photography done, and to take all these elements and to see them not as competing with each other, but as really complementing each other, to tell a story that I think just hasn't really properly been told. And Crownsville, for me, was an opportunity to tell a very American story. So it's about this institution. This book takes you through it pretty much chronologically. But the whole point is really that Crownsville has so much to teach us about these institutions, about really the psyche of our country, about our movements, our medicine, our technology, our civil rights, all through the lens and the set of characters and buildings and land associated with this one place. They're telling us a much larger story about ourselves. And so that's really what Madness is. And it was because of that personal connection for me. I don't think I knew back at 19 years old, oh, I'm going to write a book someday. In fact, I know I did not know that. I don't know that I knew, even right after graduating from college, that I was capable of doing that. But because of the connections that I built in this community, the people who I just had grown so close to, I mean, at that point, Paul Lurs and I were basically in communication every single week, whether it was an email, a phone call, or a Zoom call. I was meeting new people all the time. I started to get emails from people who were associated or had a relative who worked at Crownsville and maybe wanted to ask me some questions. And so it was staying with me. I was obsessed with the place, for a lack of a better term. And so I think just something in my spirit told me it's time to tell this story. And this is really the perfect group of people here for anyone who maybe hasn't read the book already. And so you might not know all the connections between the folks on this call here. This book would have been impossible to do without Rob. Rob is one of the first people I called actually as a teenager to ask for advice while I was still trying to get permission from the state to even just get my hands on all of this stuff. And Janice is a major character in this story. She is the living, breathing embodiment of the fight to preserve and to tell stories that maybe others didn't want told. And she has been in that fight far longer than I have. I mean, I was a baby when she was getting started in all of this. And so to be able to have all of us here on this call representing kind of different parts of this work and different vantage points, it is really just amazing. And I thank you, David, for making this possible.
And I'm very fascinated, especially, working in a historical institution, working in a place with archives. You talk about some of the records having to be rescued and, the role that Rob, Janice, and other community members may have played in that. Maybe you could talk just a little bit more about that. Why were there records, especially at the state level, that were in danger of not being preserved? I think many of us in the field maybe understand that not everything gets saved, but maybe what were some of the dynamics around that, and what were you able to learn from some of those records that may not have seen the light of day if not for some of those advocates?
Absolutely. Well, one of the first things I'll share is that Crownsville is one of the few places that this kind of work could even be possible, because the pattern that I found in the early stages of this research was that these institutions would close and then be destroyed, either completely physically destroyed in the documents with it, or those buildings, they were used for something else. The state sometimes very purposely removed or didn't talk about what had happened in some of these locations. I'm talking about similar facilities in places like Michigan, where my great-grandfather was. My great-grandfather's records were destroyed. And I couldn't do much else other than just confirm he had been there and in what years. No notes, no information about who his treatment providers were. All that's gone. And then in places like Alabama and Georgia, many of these facilities, there's just basically nothing left. And in those cases, there aren't that many living people around to give you that firsthand story of what it was like to walk those halls. So Crownsville presented this very unique opportunity. And then the other layer of this is that it is a place with, I mean, even as anyone even slightly familiar with the story knows, there is a lot of pain and struggle in a story like about an institution like this one. The people there, though, so many of the people who came to work there, whose paths crossed with this institution, really blew me away, just in terms of their dedication to the Black communities of Maryland, their understanding of the meaning, the gravity of working at or being at a place like this. And so, the state moves to close Crownsville in the early 2000s, and it's kind of a mad dash at the time. Employees described to me, dozens of them, seeing boxes piling up in hallways, panicked plans to transfer patients to other facilities like Springfield, and family members calling and worrying about the connectivity of their care, whether their loved one will even be able to trust the new team that they're about to have to work with. The hospital had kind of been thrown into chaos with this announcement that Crownsville needed to shutter. And that's even though for decades there had kind of been, of course, this movement to deinstitutionalize, a lot of similar facilities closing down. People had fought to keep this place open, to keep doing the work that they were doing in a public hospital like that one. And so when the hammer comes down, there's chaos. And as part of the chaos, things are getting lost and destroyed. Things are literally being put in the shredder. And so it's people like Paul Lurs, who had worked at the institution for 40 years, who gathered records, letters, and items and put them into a fireproof cabinet, basically. And knowing how important they were, reached out to Rob to make sure a plan was put into place. And I don't even know if Paul recognizes how amazing that is. If for anyone who's ever met him, he's so humble, it's almost infuriating. And he would never talk about him the way that I like to talk about him, as a hero. But that work is what makes this work possible. And without people like Paul and Rob, there is a real, an alternative universe. There may be no way to have told the story of Crownsville, to have looked at the letters written by its former leaders, the transcripts of phone calls between reporters and previous mental health leaders and commissioners in the state, to have a sense of how many patients were discharged or treated in a certain time period. We wouldn't, a lot is still missing. And I look at that in the book, but there's so much is there. And that is thanks to heroes like Paul, and the hard work that it takes to protect those kinds of records, to organize those records. And then on Janice's side, to bring in the community voice too, to rehabilitate physical space like a graveyard, so that people actually can visit and pay respects and make connections between what they read or what they know and what it felt like to be on that property, and to have events every year where people can come and see this site and recognize that history. These things are all really interconnected, and they're all part of making sure that history and public memory don't die. And so as a journalist, I'm so grateful that I could play a role in this, to work with historians, to work with organizers, people with deep community connections like Janice. It takes all of those pieces to get to this moment. And I know Janice is going to touch on this later, where the book isn't just able to be out there and you can kind of feel like you get to experience Crownsville from 1911 and its opening, all the way to that chaotic moment in 2004. But you can come and now visit the site. You're going to be able to be part of a living and breathing memorial, and generations to come are now going to know more about Crownsville than they may have been able to in the past. And it takes all people working in all these different directions and with these different points of view to make that moment possible.
Absolutely. And I know we want to transition and hear more from Janice as well, but and certainly we want to encourage people to get and read the book if they have not already. But I was hoping maybe you could give a couple minutes on some of the trends that you were seeing within your research, some of the things that may have struck you. I mean, Rob alluded to some of the more of the 19th century history of asylums and some of the range of treatment and the inequities that we see. But, you know, again, what was it about Crownsville that stood out, and that, you know, opened it up to scrutiny later on in the century?
Yeah, well, one of the first things I always share with people who are starting to learn about this place is it is the only asylum that I was ever able to find in my research that forced its patients to help construct it from the ground up. And Rob touched on this, an initial group of patients brought into a field in the modern Bacon Ridge Natural Area, essentially, and who are not given a place to rest or therapy or a treatment plan. They are put to work. And they begin this long, very physical process. New patients join them kind of week after week. And we know this because of the lunacy reports and pretty detailed record keeping done by the state of Maryland. And at the time, you know, you have to think about the optics and sort of the historical connections here. This is an asylum opening in 1911 for Black patients only, run entirely by white people. Many of, and to give greater context to what those leaders have been involved in and had connections to, or who they were in dialogue with, it comes after emancipation and decades of debate in this country, in Maryland, but everywhere, about Black people and why they seem to be suffering, why they're not emotionally adjusting, why they're struggling to get jobs or to function. And Maryland's part of that conversation. And one of the sort of prevailing attitudes or stereotypes that develops in medical journals and in kind of casual everyday life is that something is different about Black people, different enough that they should be treated in a different place, and different enough that, you know, this theory basically develops that they're not fully equipped to be free and to take care of themselves out in the world. And so that idea of racial difference, these discriminatory beliefs, they inform the creation of Crownsville from the very beginning. You know, you see these immediate parallels between the sort of former plantation model of the South and the use of these patients to then essentially run a plantation on these grounds. Not only are they engaged in building the institution, they run a farm, they do basket weaving, they sell goods like rugs. And they do this at rates that are a lot higher than any of the pure white institutions in the state. And so one of the arguments of the book is that no matter what era of the hospital you study or you look at, that founding, the attitudes, the beliefs, even the architectural decisions made at that time continue to inform the way that Black people experience and access mental health care in Maryland. Even for people in the 80s and 90s, I mean, you might like to think at that point, 1911 no longer matters, but the hospital at that point for decades has been underfunded, has been treated differently by state lawmakers. Employees have come and fought really challenging and in their view, often unjust conditions. And so all of those things are sort of directly reflected in and implicated in the experience and care of the patients, of the people who are coming to work and trying to do their best every day for themselves and for their communities. And the hospital really becomes reflective of the sort of broader struggles this country is moving through, from the periods of emancipation forward to this struggle to integrate, to allow Black people to become employees at Crownsville, to get jobs, to work with people who look like them, to the civil rights movement. In a case that I write about 3 civil rights protesters, a court committed to Crownsville after being labeled as insane for trying to eat at a white-owned restaurant. I mean, to the movements over Vietnam and deinstitutionalization and the sort of rise in American conservatism and tough on crime, all of these movements and moments in this country, you can see them through Crownsville and experience them as the patients have. And it was really about giving voice to this community and this place that so often in these fields has been excluded. And so, you know, it's the story of America, but through and its battles over race and inequality through the patients and the employees and the people of Crownsville.
Thank you. Thank you. And, you know, I wanted to transition and hear from Janice Hayes-Williams as well. And certainly, Janice, if you want to respond to anything we've already heard from Rob or Antonia, you're welcome to do that as well. But, you know, wanted to start out and just understand, how did you come into this work, you know, as somebody who is grounded in the local community? You know, what did Crownsville mean to you? And, you know, what are some of those ongoing efforts to make sure that this memory is not lost?
Living in Anne Arundel County, you knew about Crownsville as a child. You were threatened by your parents. If you don't do certain things, I'm going to send you to Crownsville. So that was a part of my growing up. In 2001, a new superintendent called me looking for my Uncle George Phelps. A lot of people knew him because he was able to uplift a cemetery in Annapolis. So they called looking for him. They wanted him to see the cemetery. So I went along. It was nothing that we had ever seen before. Only numbers on the stones. You go 800, 900, 1,000, 1,300. And at the very end, you can tell that people carved the names into the cement. On that day, my Uncle George and I were mortified that there could be a cemetery with no names. On that day, I decided I wanted to know who was there. So fits and starts. I went to the archives because the information is not available to the public. So I said, there has to be a way to get to these names. And we figured out we need to go through the death records of Anne Arundel County. We got volunteers to stop for years. And here comes Stuart Pittman, the county executive. After years of advisory boards, what are we going to do with Crownsville? He made a point to get the land back in the hands of the county, away from the state of Maryland. Once I figured that out, I asked people to join me to find out these names. I wanted to have all the names at the time he went to get Crownsville from the state of Maryland. One more month before he went to Larry Hogan, we found all the names in the cemetery. There are 1,727, people in that cemetery from 26 states in this country. And 4 countries are in that cemetery. We had to look at every death certificate. That creates a whole new understanding. I didn't know about Crownsville until I did that. We kept seeing drowning. There's no water around to drown. Oh my God. Hydrotherapy. People were drowning from that. Electroshock therapy. I could see my volunteers, tears in their eyes, babies, stillborn. And there was a certain period of time I couldn't make out what this was on the death certificate, so I took it to my doctor. I said, "What is this?" He said, "This is the 4th stage of syphilis." It was so many, it led us to believe that Crownsville was doing experiments in terms of syphilis. We have seen everything that you can imagine. Then on the death certificate, it says buried or removed. Normally, that means they left Crownsville and they went home with their families. But on many, it said the University of Maryland. That means that that body was used as a cadaver for medical students. We have now to 700 patients that went to Maryland because nobody came to get the bodies. So what I wanted to do was give dignity in death. They had no dignity in Crownsville State Hospital. What could I do? Find the families, perhaps? They're from Tennessee, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas. Maybe somebody will see these names and they will figure out what happened to Uncle whoever who never came home. So for my group, the Friends of the Hospital Patient Cemetery, our work is to give dignity to those patients that were lost in time. So what we have done, we went to the state of Maryland. We were able to get a bond bill. We are building a memorial to these people with all of the names from 1912 until 1965. There you can go pay homage to these people that did so much for medicine. So that's the work we have done. We will continue to praise their names, say their names every year, and the memorial will be there in the spring. I hope you will come when we dedicate it.
That's very exciting to hear. And, I definitely want to congratulate you for what's already been accomplished, but I'm excited about what's to come for next year and making sure that these commemorations get where they need to be. So as much as we can help spread the word about that and support that, that's something we want to do. I do want to transition into our Q&A component. I do have questions myself, of course, and I would keep you here for hours on end if I could. But I do want to make sure that our audience, if you have any additional questions, please put those in the Q&A. We've had a few that have come up already. But I'll just selfishly start with myself. And it's something that both Antonia and Janice referred to, which is oral history collection and, kind of involving community voices in this process. And I think the historical field has evolved to give more respect to oral history, but traditionally has not been respected or privileged as much in historical research at times. So I'm wondering if maybe both of you and Rob, feel free to chime in as well. What is that value? Talk to that value of community voices, oral history collection, especially for something that is relatively recent, and why that's so necessary.
So I will start. I just happen to work for the county. I'm doing oral histories. We have put the money in place. We have people doing oral interviews, and not just Black people. For some reason, it's not just about Black people. There are descendants of white people who work there as well. We are actually talking to people from Turkey. At some point in our history, 1950s, there was an onslaught of doctors from Turkey that came to work at Crownsville. It's opened up so much because none of their kids went to public school. Where'd you go? Sharon School. There's another element to Crownsville. So we're talking to former employees. We're talking to people who had families there. So we are doing that work. There was a grant given to the county recently to make sure that we tell the stories before, after care, because people had to go somewhere. So we found there's an organization that took the worst of the kids, nowhere to go. And we found out that there's a senator who helped with that. So the stories are coming in. After a year and a half, we have about 30 interviews already done. So I'll send you that link. You can send us your interest, and we will interview you.
I can talk about oral history too, as a journalist, and Janice was on the receiving end of this process. Someone who had to share her family history and personal story with me as part of the book. It was very clear to me, even as a very young person, the first time that I went inside the Maryland State Archives and I saw what was there. That some kind of oral history, a series of interviews would be necessary. And that's because the majority of what survived there is written from the perspective of the people who ran the place. Superintendents, their other administrators and staff, even just notes from clinicians. I mean, you can't tell the story, or you can't claim to have the full story of this place, but not have asked the people who were patients there or the people who loved patients to tell what they remember, to share what they might have stored at home. And there wasn't a whole lot recorded about the patients' personal stories, where they came from, really why they were at this hospital, or what they needed. In some cases, there were just very sparse notes left behind, even about their diagnosis or treatment plan. And so you have to acknowledge that, and kind of take what you can in there, and then supplement. And that's where oral history becomes really important. I've always found it really frustrating because I remember this conversation came up in school, it's come up as a professional journalist, it's come up on my book tour, kind of to the extent to which you can trust oral history, people's memories. And my answer to that is always, well, are you telling me that a letter from Robert Winterrode or Hugh Young, white people involved in the creation of this institution at a time when many of the people working there had openly bigoted views against the people they were treating, that their recollections or their assumptions about the people they were treating, that we can trust those because they were written, I guess, in that time. But the community that was actually supposed to be served by this institution, their recollections, their family photos, they're less valuable. I can't buy that. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't think that's a book that I would recommend the public read. And so, and then I think also, when you're doing a book that deals with African American history, oral tradition is as old a tradition for Black people of every part of the world. I mean, the entire sort of diasporic experience depends on elders and their memory and the stories they pass down. And so I think if you do any journalistic process, or you are curious about Black communities, that has to be something that you honor and that you participate in, because you will find things unlike anything else you can source or comb through just by sitting down at a table and receiving the trust of those people. And that's a huge part of the heart of this book, or times that I spent with, in some cases, very elderly members of the community, former doctors and nurses at Crownsville, former patients or siblings of patients, people who poured their hearts out to me and who trusted me and this project. And so you need that. And I always hear from readers that feeling like they got to know them as people, that's what makes this book actually readable, digestible, enjoyable for them. That otherwise it's a shameful and a painful and a very, at times kind of contradictory story, and with a lot of moral gray area. And the best way to process that is to understand, well, that's sort of the experience of being human. And I'm walking through the messiness of all that with these people. And so, it's to me, oral history is, again, it's about taking your different kinds of sources and seeing them as complements to each other, not as in competition.
Yeah, thank you for that. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, oral histories. I should say, when the annual reports were done by the state hospitals, they used to have narratives. And in the 1930s, they just become statistical, which doesn't mean a whole lot. Numbers, patients in, staff numbers. So you really can't derive much information at all.
And it's about bringing all of those things together. I think, as Antonia referenced earlier, that, that's really where you get that tapestry, you get those multiple perspectives that you need, again, as long as those perspectives have been preserved or found in the community. And I do want to acknowledge as well that we have maybe not as many questions in the chat and Q&A, but certainly some robust conversation around research strategies, folks co-signing some of what of our presenters have stated, as well as some resources to learn more about what we've been discussing this evening. So certainly as we follow up with registrants, we'll kind of compile those resources and let them know where they can find more and engage with folks from the state or from the Anne Arundel County level. But I don't think we have any final questions in the Q&A. But I do have some that I wanted to interject here. I know we're right about at 7 o'clock, but building on what Janice has shared with us, as well as some of the information from throughout the presentation, what's next, right? So there is opportunity for public commemoration, whether it be through monuments, proclamations. Often these things are coming from county or state government entities, but what more can we continue to do to not just learn, but to kind of activate this knowledge and hopefully improve things in our modern context if we can.
Well, this is an interesting time for me as the author of this book, because what I'd like to tell people is now is the time when I kind of step back, and I'm very interested to see how the community kind of takes up this kind of bubbling movement and where it goes from here. But what I do tell people is that there are public meetings. Stuart Pittman is someone with an email address. If you have questions about what's going to happen on this land, how you might be able to visit it. If you are wondering if you can help Janice and volunteer before the next Say My Name ceremony and pay your respects to patients, I know, not to speak for you, Janice, but I know you could always use another set of hands getting things ready the day before or the morning of. Or there are elders who need rides sometimes to some of these events. And so just figuring out how you can get involved, that's a huge step. There are high schoolers now in the county reading this book, learning about this history, planning visits. If you're someone who does work in public schools, supporting schools, especially at a time when a lot of schools are pulling away from subject matter like this, or they're even banning books like this one, to be someone who stands up in support of history, especially complicated and sometimes uncomfortable histories, that goes a long way. And then once the memorial and the park are created, and the county's even looking at basically a small museum there, be someone who actually visits, who financially and physically supports the place. Because that's how you send a signal to your elected officials that these things matter, and that's where your tax dollars should go. So those are the obvious steps that I ask people to think about in the coming months and years now.
And I just want to add, the campus is not open. So don't take a ride out there because you will get chased off the property. So we're hoping when the memorial comes, it will be more open, but it's going to take years, okay? There's 70 outbuildings, so many of them are going away, but you can't, it's not an open campus yet. So just stay tuned. Go to the website, look for the Crownsville Master Plan. You can see what they're doing there. It's very detailed. So it's coming in the future, but right now, don't take a chance and just get chased off the property, okay?
Well, we'll take that note to heart, Janice. We did have a question in the Q&A, and I think we talked about this offline. You may not have an exact date yet, but when will the ceremony be held in the spring? Maybe an estimate, but also folks can visit that website you just mentioned to find out more.
Yes, the Friends of the Crownsville Hospital Patient Cemetery has a Facebook page. So check that from time to time. We are estimating May of 2025. Okay? You will hear about it. The whole state will know about it.
I'll certainly plan to see you there. So as we kind of wrap up here this evening, it was just such a pleasure to be in conversation with you all. Really enjoyed learning and from the book as well as from your perspectives. So again, thank you so much for your time this evening. I know that is precious for all of us. And we would continue to encourage folks not only to learn from the scholarship, the book, records that can be found at many of these repositories, but also think about that public engagement aspect with Janice and others, and be a part of that effort to continue to push these things forward. So with that, I think we're going to move toward our end. Anything else you wanted to put in, Chloe, as we come to an end?
I don't think there's anything I can add to the wisdom and humbleness and just the wonderful work and knowledge that you all have brought today. So thank you, truly thank you for this work. I know it's hard and I know it's personal and I know it's ongoing. So behalf on MCHC and everybody who's here and people who could not be here tonight, truly thank you all. For our audience, thank you for joining. Only things to plug is that, again, this program is recorded and it will be made available in the coming weeks. We will send that link out when it is ready. Give us like 2 weeks to get it out there. And we hope those of you who are in state nearby have a few dollars to spare, which is funny to say during the holidays, but we have a lecture coming up next Thursday, the 12th, with Emily Gavault that talks about finding Black identity in early American art. So it really follows the nature of this discussion tonight, but kind of takes it from a different approach. And there's an email going out with a feedback survey. If you have any comments for our panelists, any ideas on how we can improve our programs, or you just want to let us know that you had a good time, please feel free to let us know in that feedback form. And that's all I have to add. I want to let all you wonderful people get back to your evening and just want to say another warm, very happy thank you. And thank you, David, for being a fantastic moderator, as always. Can't imagine who else would do it better.
Yes, from the panel. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chloe.
Yes.
Thanks for thinking
Thank
to
you.
host this, to make it possible for us to share and to make it so accessible for people. This was wonderful.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful
you.
evening. Stay warm. Take care. And
Good night.
yeah, good luck out there.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Goodbye.